So I want you to just look at your calendar for a second. Today is May 29th, 2026.
Right.
And I want you to count forward exactly 5 weeks from today. That puts us at July 4th, 2026.
The big day.
Yeah, exactly. Because on that exact day, a massive, heavy steel door is basically going to slam shut on the U.S. energy sector.
It's a total structural cliff. I mean, it's the kind of hard stop the industry really hasn't seen in its modern history.
Absolutely. So welcome to today's deep dive, because our mission today is to unpack this absolute paradox that we found buried in the latest energy data we've been combing through for you.
Yeah, and it is a fascinating paradox.
Right. We're looking at a piece of legislation that was specifically designed to end clean energy tax credits. That was the whole point.
That was the stated goal, yeah.
But somehow, completely by accident, it triggered the absolute largest, fastest clean energy construction mobilization in American history.
The scale of what is happening right now, like in these final 5 weeks, is frankly staggering. We are watching hundreds of billions of dollars just sprinting against a ticking clock.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy, because when I first read through our source stack, my head was totally spinning.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So imagine your favorite big box store announces that they're going out of business.
Okay.
And they say they're permanently canceling their famous, 30 to 50% off discount, but they're doing it in exactly 1 year. What happens?
People don't just shrug and stop shopping.
Exactly. They rush in, and they basically try to buy an entire decade's worth of inventory in a single afternoon.
And the hard data maps perfectly to that analogy. Like, across the country right now, energy developers are frantically rushing to what's called safe harbor. They're trying to lock in between 216 and 240 gigawatts of solar capacity before that July 4th deadline.
And just to put that number into perspective for you, that 216 to 240 gigawatts, that is equivalent to the projected U.S. solar installations for the rest of the entire decade.
Right. All of it.
All of it, compressed into this frantic 18-month sprint.
Yeah. And to understand why these companies are sprinting like their literal lives depend on it, we really have to look at the mechanics of what they're racing to grab before the lock clicks.
So let's get into those mechanics.
Yeah.
The law we're analyzing today is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA, which passed back on July 4th, 2025.
Right.
And its stated political purpose was to phase out the older IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act credits. So my first instinct reading this was, why is there a boom at all?
That makes sense.
Yeah, didn't the credits just die? If the credits were killed, why not just pack up the excavators and go home?
Well, it comes down to the architecture of project finance. Under the old IRA framework, developers really relied on the investment tax credit, the ITC.
Okay.
It provided a 30% base rate credit on the capital expenditures of a clean energy project. And if you met certain bonuses, like, say, sourcing domestic steel or building in former fossil fuel community.
Right, the energy community bonus.
So exactly. If you hit those, that credit stacked up to 50%.
Wait, 50% of the cost of a multi-billion-dollar power plant paid for by the tax code? That is massive.
It's the bedrock of the industry. I mean, it wasn't just a nice-to-have subsidy to make things look a little better on a balance sheet. It was the fundamental financing mechanism.
Okay, but I want to break down how that actually works for a second. Because a tax credit is not like a briefcase full of cash.
No, definitely not.
It's a break on your taxes.
Right.
But if I'm a solar developer, I'm spending hundreds of millions of dollars building infrastructure. I'm depreciating those assets. On paper, I might not even have any taxable income for years.
That's right.
So how does a paper tax credit help me actually buy solar panels today?
That is the perfect question, and it introduces this concept called the tax equity market. Because you're entirely correct, the developer building the solar farm usually doesn't have the tax appetite.
Right, they don't owe enough taxes to use a, $100 million credit?
Exactly. But large corporate taxpayers do. Think banks, tech giants, massive retail chains.
Oh, so they brokered a trade.
They form a partnership, yeah. The corporation buys the tax credits from the developer, typically paying about, 85 to 95 cents on the dollar.
Okay, got it.
So the corporation gets a discount on their IRS tax bill, and the developer gets upfront, cold, hard cash to actually pour the concrete and buy the transformers.
Okay, but this is where I want to push back on the industry's narrative a little bit, based on our sources.
Right.
Without that tax equity cash, the internal rate of return, the IRR, on a typical utility-scale solar project drops from roughly 9 to 12% down to about 4 to 6%.
Yeah, that's the drop.
And I hear developers in our sources calling 4% an unfinanceable disaster. But 4% is still a profit.
Sure, technically.
So why can't the industry just adapt to lower margins? Why do they absolutely need this 50% government-backed cash injection just to build a project?
Well, think about it from the perspective of risk, right?
Sure.
And the broader capital markets. If you're an institutional investor, you can take your money right now and buy a U.S. Treasury bond,
Right, which is safe.
which carries zero risk. And you get a guaranteed return hovering around 4 or 5%.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, why would you take on the immense risk of funding a 2-year construction project with weather delays, supply chain meltdowns, fluctuating energy prices, permitting lawsuits?
Just to make the exact same 4% you could make by sitting on your couch holding a government bond.
You wouldn't. The risk premium just isn't there. Capital flows to the path of least resistance.
Okay, so that makes the ITC literally life or death for these projects.
Exactly. Without it, the math simply doesn't justify the risk. And that brings us to the loophole in the OBBBA that created this entire frenzy in the first place.
The safe harbor loophole.
Right. The legislation didn't kill the credits immediately on the day it was signed. It created a safe harbor deadline of July 4th, 2026.
Ticking clock.
Yeah. The rule essentially says that if you can prove you began construction on your project by that date, you get to keep those highly lucrative old IRA-era economics. And not only that, you get a massive grace period. You have up to 4 years to actually finish the project and place it in service.
So you secure the funding structure of the past with a runway into the future.
Precisely.
You know, there's an assessment from the Georgetown Environmental Law Review in our source notes that perfectly captures the irony here.
Oh, yeah, I love that quote.
They point out that the legislative structure of the OBBBA, which was overtly drafted to rein in clean energy support, inadvertently triggered what they classify as the most significant short-term expansion of infrastructure in U.S. history.
It is just a masterclass in unintended consequences. But here's the catch. Getting through that safe harbor window is no longer just a simple paperwork exercise.
Right.
The door is closing, and an immense physical traffic jam is blocking the entrance.
It kind of feels like everyone is trying to evacuate a massive stadium, but they all have to go through one single revolving door.
It's a great way to put it.
And the reason they're jammed up is because the IRS actually changed the rules of what it means to begin construction.
Yeah, previously, developers relied on what was called the 5% safe harbor rule. You could lock in your status just by incurring 5% of the total project costs.
Which means you could just buy 5% worth of solar panels, stack them in a warehouse somewhere out in Nevada and tell the IRS, hey, we've begun construction. We got the panels right here.
Yeah, it was incredibly permissive. But the IRS closed that pathway in January 2026. Now, to meet this July 4th deadline, developers must prove significant physical work on the actual physical site.
Oh, wow. So no more warehouses.
Nope. You have to be out there pouring concrete foundations, erecting steel racking, digging miles of trenches.
But logically, I mean, if I'm a multi-billion-dollar energy consortium, money isn't really my primary object.
Sure.
If I need to show physical work to secure a tax credit worth hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm just going to hire every excavator in the county, drive them out to the desert, and start digging holes. Why is that so hard?
Because you can't just dig a hole to nowhere.
Fair point.
You can't install racking if you don't have the specialized steel. And you certainly can't start significant electrical work if you don't have the foundational grid components. You see, money cannot magically alter the physical reality of global supply chains.
Right.
We are seeing cascading failures across multiple physical bottlenecks right now.
So let's follow that supply chain failure, starting with heavy equipment.
Yeah.
In our reading, the loudest screaming from developers is all about high-voltage transformers.
The wait times there are devastating. High-voltage transformers currently have a 2 to 4 year global lead time.
Wait, 2 to 4 years just to take delivery?
Yes. And we aren't just talking about, a box on a pole outside your house. These are massive, custom-engineered pieces of infrastructure required to step up the voltage from the solar farm so it can travel on the interstate transmission lines.
Right, the big stuff.
And there's a severe global manufacturing constraint for the specialized electrical steel required to build them. Couple that constraint with surging simultaneous demand from AI data centers and general grid upgrades.
Oh, because everyone needs power right now.
Exactly. The backlog is immense. If a developer didn't order their substation equipment by late 2023 or early 2024, they cannot start significant physical work today. The hardware simply doesn't exist yet.
And even if you miraculously secured a transformer, you run headfirst into the bureaucratic reality of the power grid itself, right? The interconnection queue.
This might actually be the most intractable problem of all.
So to help you visualize this, think about adding a massive new wing to your house. You can't just plug all your new heavy power tools into the existing wall socket, right? You'd blow the fuse for the entire house.
Right.
Now scale that up. When you want to plug a 500 megawatt solar farm into the regional grid, grid operators have to run exhausting engineering studies.
They have to map the entire network to ensure your new power won't literally melt the existing transmission wires or, destabilize the voltage for millions of homes.
And those engineering studies take an enormous amount of time. In major regional areas like PJM covering the Mid-Atlantic or KSO out in California, the wait times just to get through those studies and receive a grid connection agreement are now stretching 5 to 7 years.
5 to 7 years. So if you weren't already deep in that bureaucratic waiting room half a decade ago, no amount of money today can fast-track the physics studies required to let you pour concrete.
You're just locked out.
Completely locked out. But, okay, let's say you beat the transformer shortage and you survive the interconnection queue. You still have to buy the actual solar panels.
Right.
And this introduces a massive geopolitical hurdle called FEOC compliance.
Foreign entity of concern. This is where the policy creates like an impossible trap for developers. Our sources highlight that the OBBBA strictly mandates that any project receiving material assistance from an EOC loses its tax credit eligibility entirely.
Entirely.
And when we talk about solar panels, we are overwhelmingly talking about China.
The global market concentration is undeniable. Chinese companies currently supply roughly 70% of all U.S. utility-scale solar panels, and because of their manufacturing scale, they're typically 15 to 30% cheaper than domestic alternatives.
So put yourself in the shoes of a developer sprinting toward July 4th. The panels you normally buy, the ones that make up 70% of the world's supply, will instantly vaporize your tax credit if you use them.
Right.
So you're forced to abandon your standard supply chain and scramble for premium U.S.-made panels from companies like Qcells or First Solar. But everybody else is doing the exact same thing at the exact same time.
Yeah, and the domestic manufacturing base is robust, but it was absolutely not scaled to handle an overnight 200-plus gigawatt rush. So you have developers with the money, the permits, and the transformers who simply cannot source compliant panels in time to show physical work.
And if you somehow navigate all of that, you got the transformer, the permits, the compliant American panels, you arrive at the final, most human bottleneck of all, labor.
Labor. The artificial deadline has compressed years of normal construction sequencing into just a few months. Every single developer in the country needs the exact same specialized heavy lift crane operators, the exact same high voltage electricians.
And the exact same iron workers at the exact same time.
Yeah. You can't pour a massive concrete foundation if there's no one available to drive the cement truck.
Right. The competition for labor is causing massive wage inflation and schedule delays across the board.
Which perfectly contextualizes a quote I pulled from Electric on May 28, 2026. They summed it up by writing, U.S. clean energy is booming and unraveling at the same time.
That is quite the visual.
They noted that in the first quarter of 2026 alone, an astounding 54 new large-scale projects were announced. But in that exact same 3-month window, 38 projects were formally canceled.
Oh, wow. 38 canceled. That is the violent whiplash of a safe harbor sprint.
Exactly. The projects that had the foresight to order transformers years ago, secure grid permits early, and lock in compliant supply chains, they are booming.
And the ones that tried to jump in late?
They're hitting a brick wall of physical reality and unraveling completely.
So solar and wind are desperately fighting for survival in this traffic jam before the July 4th cutoff. But as you dig deeper into the source material, a massive asymmetry emerges.
Yeah. This is huge.
There is one specific clean energy technology that is sitting comfortably on the sidelines, completely insulated from this panic.
Battery storage. It is the great exception in the legislation.
Yeah. Under the OBBBA, battery storage gets to keep its full ITC eligibility all the way through December 2033.
Wow.
It gets 7 extra years that solar and wind simply do not have.
Yeah.
So, the obvious question we have to ask on behalf of anyone looking at this rationally, why the double standard?
Right.
If the political goal of the bill was to aggressively cut clean energy tax credits, why did battery storage get a free pass?
Well, to understand that carve-out, you have to really separate the technology from the traditional climate narrative. Battery storage, specifically the LFP or lithium iron phosphate chemistry that dominates the utility-scale market, isn't viewed by policymakers merely as a green technology.
Okay.
It is viewed as critical grid reliability infrastructure.
Got it. So it's not just about the environment, it's about making sure the lights don't flicker.
Exactly. Look at the operational reality for grid managers in places like Texas, the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest. They were facing unprecedented exponential power demands.
Mostly driven by the massive deployment of AI data centers, right?
Hmm.
Which require just a staggering amount of constant power.
Yes. At the same time, grid operators have to manage the daily evening drop-off, when solar generation goes offline, but power demand spikes.
Right, when everyone gets home from work, turns on their air conditioning, but the sun is setting.
Exactly that dynamic.
Huh.
So the grid operators lobbied hard. The arguments that saved the battery tax credits were entirely centered on energy security, economic stability, and grid resilience.
Because you need massive batteries to absorb power when it's abundant and discharge it when the AI data centers and evening cooling loads threaten to just crash the system entirely.
Yeah. We maintain strict neutrality on policy here, but you can clearly see the practical mechanics of that decision.
Sure. Regardless of a lawmaker's political stance on the energy transition, if an exploding AI tech sector threatens to brown out their home state's electrical grid, they're going to vote to subsidize the batteries that prevent it.
Makes sense. And the financial markets certainly recognize that reality. Because of that 7-year runway, developers are deploying capital with immense confidence.
Absolutely.
24 gigawatts of utility-scale storage are planned for deployment in 2026 alone. And if we look globally, the grid-scale battery market is rocketing toward a projected $67.5 billion by 2033. Batteries unequivocally won the legislative lottery.
It really did.
So we see the anatomy of the mad dash. The solar and wind developers are sprinting toward a brick wall, while the battery developers are, just jogging on a padded track.
Right.
But I want to zoom out and fast forward. What actually happens to your power grid and the U.S. energy landscape on July 5th, 2026, when the dust finally settles and the door is locked? Well, that is when the structural damage hiding beneath this short-term boom becomes visible. The data is sobering. The 10-year U.S. solar output forecast is now 17% lower than it would have been under continuous uninterrupted policy support.
17% less generation capacity over a decade. Yeah. A massive volume of electricity just removed from the board.
Yeah. We effectively traded long-term, stable, predictable growth for a massive, chaotic adrenaline spike, followed by a cliff.
Right.
Because after July 4th, the pipeline for new utility-scale solar and wind in the U.S. gets very thin very quickly. It will take years for the industry to restructure its financing models without the ITC.
Which raises an existential question based on these sources. Does this mean the clean energy transition is failing globally? Because a 17% drop in the world's largest economy sounds like a fatal blow.
It sounds like it, yeah. But it is crucial to separate the U.S. policy environment from the impartial global data. The broader global transition is largely unaffected by the OBBBA. Yeah. If we examine Bloomberg-NEF's new energy outlook for 2026, solar is still unambiguously projected to be the world's largest single source of electricity by 2032.
Okay, so the rest of the world isn't hitting the brakes just because the U.S. altered its tax code?
Right. The physics and the economics of global energy don't just stop. What happens is that the United States transitions into a secondary market in terms of new build-out share.
Because capital is fluid.
Exactly. Sovereign funds and multinational developers will simply pivot. Countries like Germany, India, Australia, Brazil, and Chile are rapidly expanding their infrastructure to fill the void. The global momentum continues. The U.S. just plays a proportionately smaller role in it.
So bringing it all back home, what does this mean for you as you watch this unfold? We've synthesized 3 key indicators from our sources that you should be watching closely as 2026 wraps up, and we'd actually go over this legislative cliff.
So the first indicator is regulatory enforcement. We need to watch how strictly the IRS actually enforces that significant physical work rule.
Right. Will they be pragmatic and allow projects with, say, minor delays to slip through? Or will they take a hardline stance and just disqualify marginal projects?
That's a billion-dollar question. Because if they are strict, a massive chunk of that 240 gigawatt boom might vanish overnight.
Wow. Which ties directly to the second indicator, right? The gap between intent and reality.
Yes. We have to watch the actual ratio between safe harbor announcements and steel-in-the-ground completion. How much of this frenzy was just corporate posturing, and how many of these plants actually get wired into the grid by 2030?
And the final thing to watch is state-level action.
crucial point. We need to see whether states with strong renewable portfolio mandates like California, New York, Colorado, or Illinois step up with their own state-level financial incentives to subsidize the gap left by the federal pullback.
It's essentially state governments trying to catch a really heavy baton that the federal government just dropped.
Exactly. The aggression and pace of that state-level action will ultimately determine how steep the July 5th cliff really is for regional economies.
So let's bring this all together. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act was built to end the era of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah.
But instead, through the quirk of a hard, unforgiving deadline, it created a record-breaking 86-gigawatt construction sprint in a single year.
Yeah.
The boom you are seeing in the headlines right now is entirely real, but the impending cliff on July 4th is just as real.
And this isn't just an abstract exercise in corporate finance, you know. The outcome of this 5-week scramble will directly dictate the supply and the cost of the electricity powering your home.
Right.
It will determine whether regional grids have the capacity to host the next wave of AI innovation, and it fundamentally shifts the balance of global energy deployment for the next 10 years.
It all comes down to how much physical infrastructure can be shoved through that revolving door before the lock clicks shut. So I'm going to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Think back to that store going out of business, with everyone rushing the aisles to grab what they can. If a hard, fast deadline accidentally created the absolute largest infrastructure mobilization in U.S. history, wait, what could we achieve if we actually designed policies to trigger an urgent sprint instead of a slow marathon?
That really challenges everything we assume about human behavior, risk, and market incentives.
Something to think about the next time your air conditioning kicks on during a summer heat wave. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll catch you next time.